Hey kid, do you like violence? No? Well, do you want to fight ghouls wearing a hockey mask covering both of your eyelids? Are you coming on to me? Well, I think you should play Splatterhouse then. Dude, what even is all this stuff? Evidence? Wait, what? Cosplay. I said cosplay. For what? Oh man, he left a confession in here. Released in 1988 for the Turbografx-16, Splatterhouse is a home conversion of the popular horror arcade game of the same name by Namco. The title is a side-scrolling beat-em-up that tells the tale of a muscle-bound guy named Rick as he explores a creepy mansion and tries to rescue his girlfriend from demons, specters, and other Halloween-y foes. Over the years, the game has become known as one of the Turbografx's killer apps, and has become fairly synonymous with the system. On top of that, the game is often regarded as being one of the first true horror titles due to how it went out of its way to depict violence in a more explicit way than some of its contemporaries did. Splatterhouse is one of those games that I never played growing up, but I did hear about it quite often as I was getting into retro gaming. While I'm not the biggest horror buff out there outside of any academic curiosity I have for the genre and its influence on film as a whole, I have been looking for an arcadey game to get into lately and have been meaning to dive into the Turbografx library for quite a while now. And because of all of that, I'm actually pretty psyched to get to play through one of the Turbografx's most beloved titles. But does it hold up? Because, as I've said on my channel at least a few times already, the fact that a game is influential or iconic at the time of its release often has little to no bearing over whether or not it's worth revisiting over 30 years later. And while these qualities can't and shouldn't be discounted from the game's legacy and stuff, they won't always necessarily factor into whether or not the game is fun for every player that comes across it. Before we continue though, a quick question of the day. What's a console that you'd really like to own someday, and what are a couple of the games that you're interested in playing once you do? For me, I've got to go with the Sega Saturn. I've loved Sega's home consoles for as long as I can remember, and I'm a proud owner of a Sega Genesis and Dreamcast, so the Saturn seems like a no-brainer for me. And once I do finally pull the trigger and pick up a Saturn of my own, I'm really interested in playing through the original version of Knights, stuff like Daytona USA or Virtua Fighter, and because it's a guilty pleasure game of mine, Sonic R. And if I feel comfortable going broke for a little while, perhaps the Panzer Dragoon trilogy too while I'm at it. Be sure to leave your answer to the question of the day over in the comments. I'd love to hear your answer. And with that out of the way, on with the video. Splatterhouse takes place across 7 levels that are each broken up into several short stages with the simple objective of traveling to the end of the stage, beating the ever-loving crap out of anything in your way, and then defeating a boss that'll flash enough times to probably hurt your eyes if you're sensitive to that sort of thing like I am. And that's really the game in a nutshell. Being an arcade title from the mid to late 80s, Splatterhouse is a prime example of the sort of pick up and play action that typifies the arcade experience. However, despite it being simple enough in its premise, the game still feels a cut above some of those other titles from the era due to its attention to detail. While Splatterhouse's basic gameplay can best be described as it goes out of its way to give each of the enemies you encounter enough unique death animations that give the game a lot of character. Adding to this is the fact that you can also access a bunch of weapons that vary the gameplay a bit and are just a lot of fun to use. However, I could have done with a few more items in general though, both in terms of the arsenal at your disposal and the actual number of item drops in each of the game's levels. While I understand that the game has its roots in the arcade and as such is designed to suck quarters out of your pocket faster than a vacuum cleaner at a dust convention, I personally would have appreciated if the game had been adapted to be more of a dopamine releasing splatterfest than a straight up port. And yeah, I realize that may have been a bit controversial of me to say, and I honestly hope I didn't offend any fans of the game by saying it, but I feel like the game would have had better legs to stand on 30 years later had it opted to build off of what worked so well in the original while casting aside some of the things that were only really there because the game was for arcades. And I realize that this would have had some huge ramifications for the game's difficulty too, but again, I think the game's difficulty has more to do with the fact that it was designed to rob players of their quarters than it does
does anything else. Plus, if the game was being adapted and changed for home consoles, the developers could have also accounted for that by making the levels longer or feature more enemies within them to begin with. As it is though, it's not much of a problem and the items themselves are a blast to use. Especially the shotgun, which just feels powerful and like it was made to hurt somebody.
Yeah.
Anyway, when you get down to it, the base gameplay is something that we've all seen before in other games, such as Kung Fu or Altered Beast, even with the inclusion of power-ups. But there's honestly nothing wrong with that as far as I'm concerned, and I actually really enjoyed the game because of it. Plus, Splatterhouse's real claim to fame, its epic violence, goes a long way in helping differentiate the game from its contemporaries. When it comes to violence in video games, I've never honestly been that big of a fan of it. However, Splatterhouse is a bit of an exception for me due to how a big factor of why this game is so fondly remembered is due to how it was among the first games to depict this sort of thing in the medium.
At the very least, it helps the game stand out from stuff like Altered Beast, which has pretty similar gameplay only with a bit more
Rise from your grave.
as opposed to
Splatterhouse also tries to give the player a bit more variety by offering multiple pathways through several of its stages. This is something that I really appreciated, as it helps encourage multiple playthroughs and improves on the longevity of a game that's otherwise fairly short and can be beaten in about an hour. While this game's length may be an issue for some players, I actually kinda loved it. I felt like the game didn't outstay its welcome due to being a bit on the short side, and that it managed to get the most utility out of its gameplay style and concept in the process. And while short by today's standards, it is worth remembering that it's ultimately an arcade port and that many games tended to only be an hour or two long back in the late 80s. Splatterhouse is a mostly well-balanced game that usually isn't that hard during its normal stages, but can quickly become more difficult once you get to the stage's boss. That's not to say it's a problem though, as the bosses themselves are mostly pretty well designed and usually rely on some pattern recognition in order to dodge their attacks before you can swoop in and punch them repeatedly.
Oh, you did it again!
Oh, and before anyone tries to call me out about it in the comments, you can also kick in the game. But like, isn't kicking just punching with your feet?
Hello everyone, my name is Mike. I am a 3rd degree black belt and a karate teacher. So yeah, kicking is not punching with your feet like Nick so stupidly claimed. It actually involves
You can also perform a slide kick that can come in handy from time to time too, but if I'm being honest, I only managed to do this a couple of times during my playthrough by accident. Overall, Splatterhouse is a pretty fun experience, even if I found myself kinda underwhelmed by it. I think this is due to some of the glowing statements that I've heard about the game over the years from fans of the series, and how it may have just overhyped the game for me or something though. I definitely wouldn't go out of my way to call the game bad or anything, nor would I even go as far as to call it middle of the road, but something about Splatterhouse just didn't click for me.
Don't believe the hype, people!
Which is totally valid, I think. It's totally possible to play a game and know it's good, even if you didn't particularly care for it. I just feel like I have a partial bias against this game because I'm not into violence unless it's macabre or over the top. And plus, I did actually enjoy the game.
Though to be fair, some of the game definitely feels a little self-aware in its execution. After all, how many other games can you think of that feature a boss that revolves around punching floating knives? It probably also didn't help that I just preferred the permutation of this game's gameplay found in some of its contemporaries like Altered Beast, even if I also think a lot of my affection for that game is informed by nostalgia. Again, that really isn't a knock on the game's quality in itself and has more to do with my personal preferences though. One of the things I've gotta hand Splatterhouse though is the fact that it's a great looking game, and that its visuals go a long way in elevating the experience for me. While the Turbografx-16 port obviously doesn't look as good as its arcade original, I personally thought that the game boasted some great sprite work, and I really appreciated the fact that each of the enemy types within the game featured unique death animations. It just kept things stimulating for me and stood out to me in a way that, to reference my example from earlier, Altered Beast didn't.
I actually can't tell if I like this game anymore.
While I don't recall the game featuring anything along the lines of parallax scrolling or anything, it's still a pretty impressive title for the late 80s. Because seriously, while I mentioned that I'm not the biggest fan of violence for violence sake and entertainment, half of the fun of Splatterhouse for me was watching all the different ways that I could mutilate my enemies. Simply put, the game features a ton of animations that are really fun to watch. It's a level of violence that you didn't really see in games until stuff like Mortal Kombat came out a few years later, and I genuinely loved getting to watch each and every one of them. And while the graphics themselves are toned down both in terms of content and complexity from the arcade original, they genuinely look fantastic for a home port from the era. In fact, I actually kind of prefer them to the arcade's graphics despite the fact that they're not as complex. There's a certain chunkiness and contrast to the Turbografx visuals that I just really enjoyed. However, and I did mention this in passing earlier, the game's visuals aren't perfect. The game likes to engage in the early video game staple of including flashing assets on screen that can prove to be a bit overstimulating for some players at best, or potentially seizure-inducing for some at worst. And in case you're curious or concerned about that, just know that I've adjusted the frame rate of some of this game's footage here to hopefully try and circumvent that for my viewers. This won't apply to all players, but I genuinely found myself struggling with headaches and general overstimulation while I was playing this game due to suffering from some light sensitivity issues. While the screen flashing is usually regulated to bosses whenever you hit them, I felt compelled to bring this issue up in case anyone suffers from similar problems with visual stimuli and was thinking of playing the game.
It's like my mom always said, you're better off knowing if a game could give you a seizure than waking up on the floor with a concussion. That lady always has the weirdest advice for me.
Splatterhouse has a fairly good soundtrack that, much like the visuals, makes pretty good use of the console's hardware. It does a solid job of mixing catchy and more bombastic jingles with slower and more atmospheric pieces in a way that fits each of the stages that they're used in, as well as helps give them a little extra personality. Add to that the fact that the game has some seriously satisfying sound effects and you're in for a good time. My only complaint, if you could even really call it one, is that each of the songs tend to run a bit on the short side and loop way too soon for my liking. It's not a huge issue due to how short the game's levels themselves are, but with music as genuinely catchy as this game's can get, I kinda wish they ran a bit longer. Also, it probably would have made editing this video just a bit easier. If you like chiptune music and haven't heard this game's soundtrack before, I highly recommend it to you. It's got some great stuff in it, and it's totally worth a listen.
So does Splatterhouse hold up? Well, yeah, kinda. All in all, I think it's a pretty good game with music and visuals that go a long way in elevating the experience for me. Which makes sense, you know, graphics and music are as vital to the experience as the gameplay is in some cases, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
However, while perfectly adequate in its own right and definitely fun to play, I also thought that Splatterhouse's main gameplay was just a bit too by the numbers for me. As I mentioned earlier in the review, this could be because of all the hype I've heard about this game from over the years, or the fact that I've simply played too many other games with similar gameplay before. Splatterhouse's gameplay just didn't stand out to me as being particularly noteworthy outside of what it represented back in the late 80s due to being a more violent video game.
But while I was writing the review, I actually found myself looking back at my experience with this game rather fondly, which means that I now think it does hold up.
So if you're looking for a pretty good side-scrolling beat-em-up to play over Halloween or just in general, I suppose you can't really go wrong with Splatterhouse. At the very least, you'll be playing a game that means a lot to a bunch of gamers out there, as well as a game that helped usher in a more violent era of video games.
Anyway, with that said and done, that brings us to the end of this video. Feel free to like, comment, or subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and feel free to support this channel over on Buy Me a Coffee by following the link down in the pinned comment or description. On top of that, feel free to answer the question of the day down in the comments if you haven't already, and feel free to leave a recommendation or two for a game you want to see me cover in a future video while you're at it. Oh, and if you want to follow me on social media, feel free to look up @NichePlays on Twitter or Instagram, or by following the links down in the description. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and that if you do decide to play through Splatterhouse, that you have a great time doing so. So yeah. Bye.